For 800 years, Britain ruled Ireland. It took Ireland's land, its language, its trade, and during the Great Famine of 1845, it presided over the death of 1 million Irish people and the emigration of another million in a country of 8 million. Ireland left the United Kingdom in 1922 as one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. Britain was still the center of a global empire. For most of the 20th century, the question of which country was richer was not a question. Then Ireland made three decisions. It joined Europe, it cut its corporate tax to 12.5%, and it invited every American technology company in the world to call Dublin home. Today, Ireland's GDP per capita is higher than Britain's. The country that was colonized is now richer than the country that colonized it. This is the story of how that happened. The colonized, now richer than the colonizer. This is what 100 years of different choices looks like. Ireland's economic transformation is not a miracle, it is a strategy. Low corporate tax attracted the world's most profitable companies. EU membership gave those companies tariff-free access to 450 million consumers. English-language universities gave them a skilled workforce. The result is an economy where GDP per capita statistics are distorted by multinational profit booking. But even the more honest measure, modified GNI, puts Ireland clearly ahead of the UK. Britain's story runs in the opposite direction, a post-war model that worked until it didn't, a deindustrialization that was never fully replaced, and a Brexit vote that severed the country from the trading framework Ireland used to get rich. The episode ends on the question neither country can fully answer. What does Britain do now, and can Ireland's model survive the OECD global minimum tax that threatens its central competitive advantage? Chapter 1. 1922. Independence and the Weight of History. When Ireland left the United Kingdom in 1922, it left with almost nothing. 800 years of colonial rule had systematically prevented Irish industrialization, restricted Irish trade to serve British interests, and transferred land ownership to British landlords and Protestant settlers. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, in which 1 million people died and another million emigrated while Ireland continued to export food to Britain under armed guard, had reduced the Irish population from 8 million to 6 million and created a trauma that shaped Irish political and economic culture for a century. The Irish diaspora that the famine created, today estimated at 70 million people worldwide who claim Irish descent, would later become one of the most valuable assets the Irish state ever had, particularly in its relationship with the United States. The Ireland that achieved independence in 1922 was rural, agricultural, and deeply conservative. Its economy was built around cattle and dairy exports to Britain, the same customer it had just fought to leave. Its infrastructure was underdeveloped outside Dublin and a handful of other cities. Its political culture was dominated by the Catholic Church, which shaped education, healthcare, and social policy in ways that would constrain economic modernization for decades. The new Irish state immediately descended into a civil war between those who accepted the partition that left 6 northern counties under British rule and those who did not. It was not an auspicious beginning. Britain in 1922 was still at the center of a global empire. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. British manufacturing, steel, shipbuilding, textiles, still dominated global export markets. The gap between the two countries was not close to ambiguous. Britain was one of the world's great powers. Ireland was an agricultural backwater that had just freed itself, at significant cost, from the country it depended on for almost everything. Before I explain what Ireland did to reverse this, I want you to hold a question. If you were building a new country from scratch, with no industrial base, no capital, a deeply traumatized population, and your only significant asset was proximity to the country that just colonized you, what would you do first? Ireland's answer took 50 years to become clear, but when it became clear, it was one of the most effective economic strategies any small country has ever executed.
Chapter 2. Britain's Post-War Economic Model: Empire, Welfare, and Managed Decline. Britain's post-war economic model was built on three pillars that seemed complementary in 1945, but proved increasingly contradictory by the 1970s. The first pillar was the welfare state. The National Health Service, founded in 1948, along with universal education, public housing, and a social security system that provided a floor beneath British workers that had not existed before. The second pillar was nationalized industry. Coal, steel, railways, telecoms, and energy were brought into public ownership on the theory that the state could coordinate investment and production more effectively than the market. The third pillar was sterling's role as a global reserve currency, which gave Britain financial influence far beyond what its economic size warranted, but also imposed painful constraints whenever Britain tried to devalue its currency to make its exports competitive. These three pillars produced a reasonably successful economy through the 1950s and into the 1960s, but they produced it more slowly than the rest of Europe. Germany, France, Italy, and the Netherlands, all devastated by the Second World War, grew faster than Britain through the 1950s and 1960s. The phrase that haunted British economic policy for 2 decades was the British disease. Low productivity, powerful trade unions resistant to change, nationalized industries that consumed subsidies without delivering competitiveness, and a political class that oscillated between spending commitments it could not afford and austerity measures that produced recession. By 1976, Britain had to request an IMF bailout, a humiliation for the country that had helped design the Bretton Woods system. Thatcherism, beginning in 1979, was the rupture with this model. Margaret Thatcher privatized nationalized industries, broke the power of the trade unions, deregulated financial services, and rebuilt the British economy around services, above all around the City of London's role as Europe's financial capital. The results were real but uneven. Financial services boomed, manufacturing collapsed, and the regional divide between prosperous London and the deindustrialized Midlands and North widened in ways that are still shaping British politics today. By 2016, the communities that had never recovered from deindustrialization voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. Chapter 3. The Three Decisions That Changed Everything. Ireland's economic transformation was not a single event. It was the accumulation of 3 decisions made across 3 decades that compounded into one of the most dramatic reversals in economic history. The first decision was made in the late 1950s under Taoiseach Sean Lemass and his economic advisor T.K. Whitaker. Ireland would abandon protectionism and open its economy to foreign direct investment. The Shannon Free Zone, established in 1959, was the prototype, a special economic area near Shannon Airport where foreign companies could operate with low taxes and no tariffs. It was, in retrospect, a version of what China would do with its special economic zones 20 years later. The IDA, the Industrial Development Authority, became one of the world's most effective national investment promotion agencies, systematically targeting American companies that wanted a European manufacturing base. The second decision was to join the European Economic Community in 1973 alongside Britain. This was transformational for Ireland in ways it was not for Britain. For Britain, the EEC was a trading arrangement with economically similar neighbors, useful but not structurally transformative. For Ireland, the EEC was access to 300 million consumers, structural funds that built roads and infrastructure the Irish state could not have afforded alone, and above all, independence from Britain as its only significant export market. Ireland used EEC membership to escape the dependency on Britain that colonialism had built. British membership of the same institution, paradoxically, was what made Irish independence economically complete. The third decision, and the most consequential, was the 12.5% corporate tax rate, formalized in 2003, but with roots going back to the 1980s. At a time when European corporate tax rates averaged 35 to 40%, Ireland offered the world's most profitable companies a rate that was less than a third of what they would pay almost anywhere else in Europe. Combined with EU single market access, English language, common law legal system, and an educated young workforce, the 12.5% rate made Ireland the obvious European headquarters choice for American multinationals. They came in extraordinary numbers.
Chapter 4. The Celtic Tiger, 1995 to 2007. The Celtic Tiger, the period of Irish economic growth between roughly 1995 and 2007, produced growth rates that no other developed economy came close to matching. Between 1995 and 2000, Ireland's GDP grew at an average of 9.4% per year. In the same period, the UK grew at approximately 3%. Germany grew at 1.5%. The transformation was physical as well as statistical. Dublin went from a relatively modest city with significant unemployment and emigration to a European capital with traffic jams, a housing shortage, and net immigration for the first time in its history. Irish people who had left for London, Boston, and Sydney began coming home. The sources of the Celtic Tiger growth were multiple and are still debated by economists. Foreign direct investment was the structural engine, American companies locating manufacturing and later services in Ireland, employing Irish workers, paying Irish corporate tax at 12.5%, and booking profits in Irish subsidiaries. EU structural funds built the infrastructure, motorways, ports, and broadband that made Ireland competitive. An unusually young population, produced by the high birth rates of the 1970s and 1980s, entered the workforce in large numbers through the 1990s, and a property boom, fueled by low European interest rates following Euro adoption in 1999, added construction to the growth story in a way that would later prove catastrophic. The 2008 global financial crisis hit Ireland harder than almost any other developed economy. Irish banks had lent recklessly into the property bubble. When the bubble burst, the Irish government guaranteed the bank's liabilities, a decision that transferred private bank debt onto the Irish state and produced one of the largest fiscal adjustments in OECD history. Ireland accepted an EU-IMF bailout in 2010. Unemployment reached 15%. Emigration resumed. The Celtic Tiger was over. And then Ireland did something that very few countries in economic crisis have managed. It recovered, quickly and completely. By 2013, it had exited the bailout program ahead of schedule. By 2015, it was the fastest-growing economy in Europe. By 2022, it was running the largest budget surplus as a share of GDP of any EU member state. The recovery was built on the same foundations as the original Tiger: multinationals, corporate tax, and the EU single market. Chapter 5. Brexit. Britain votes to leave Ireland's framework. On June 23, 2016, the United Kingdom voted 52 to 48% to leave the European Union. The decision was celebrated by its supporters as a reassertion of British sovereignty. Its economic consequences are still unfolding, and they fall disproportionately on the relationship between Britain and Ireland. The Ireland problem was the only Brexit problem that had no clean solution. The Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which remained part of the UK, share a 499-kilometre land border. Before Brexit, that border was invisible. Both sides were in the EU single market and customs union. Goods and people moved freely, and the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which ended the Troubles, was built on the assumption that the border would remain open. Brexit made the border a problem that 3 successive British governments spent 4 years failing to solve. The Northern Ireland Protocol, replaced by the Windsor Framework in 2023, created an effective customs border in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, a political compromise that satisfied no one fully and confirmed that Britain had no good options once it decided to leave the single market. For Ireland, Brexit was simultaneously a threat and an opportunity. The threat: Britain was Ireland's second-largest trading partner, and any friction on UK-Ireland trade would hurt Irish exporters. The opportunity: every financial services company, every pharmaceutical company, every American tech firm with a European headquarters in London that needed to remain inside the European single market after Brexit had to find an alternative. Many of them chose Dublin. Between 2016 and 2022, Dublin gained over 400 financial services firms that relocated from London, adding thousands of high-paying jobs and billions in tax revenue. Brexit accelerated Irish growth at the precise moment it began to damage British growth.
Chapter 6: The Numbers That Define the Reversal. 4 numbers from the comparison deserve specific attention. The first, GDP per capita. Ireland's headline GDP per capita reached approximately $106,000 in 2024, among the highest in the world, but this number is significantly distorted by the practice of American multinationals booking profits in their Irish subsidiaries. The more honest measure, Modified Gross National Income, or GNI, strips out most of the multinational distortion and puts Irish living standards at approximately $62,000 per person. The UK's GDP per capita reached approximately $48,000 in 2024. On either measure, the distorted GDP or the adjusted GNI, Ireland now exceeds the UK by a significant margin. The reversal is real regardless of which number you use. The second, trade exposure to Britain. Ireland sends approximately 10% of its goods exports to the UK, down from over 70% at independence. Britain sends approximately 11% of its goods exports to the EU 27 combined, down from approximately 45% before Brexit, as British exporters have redirected trade or simply exported less. The direction of travel is opposite. Ireland has been diversifying away from Britain for 50 years. Britain, post-Brexit, finds itself with less access to its largest trading partner than it has had at any point since the 1970s. The third, corporate tax revenue. Ireland collected approximately 24 billion euros in corporation tax in 2023, an extraordinary sum for a country of 5.1 million people. Approximately 85% of that revenue came from 10 companies, almost all of them American. This concentration is both Ireland's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. The UK's corporation tax revenue is spread more broadly and less dependent on any single nationality of company, but the UK rate of 25%, raised from 19% in 2023, has made it less attractive as a location for new investment. The fourth, productivity growth since 2016. Since the Brexit vote, UK productivity growth has been among the weakest in the G7. Irish productivity growth has been among the strongest, driven almost entirely by the multinational sector. The gap in productivity explains the gap in living standards more clearly than any other single metric. Chapter 7: What Brexit has cost Britain. The economic cost of Brexit is contested by its supporters and its critics, but the data that has accumulated since 2020 points consistently in one direction. The Centre for European Reform estimates that by 2024, the UK economy was approximately 5% smaller than it would have been had Brexit not occurred. That is equivalent to approximately $100 billion of lost output per year, more than the entire annual NHS budget. UK goods exports to the EU have fallen in real terms since Brexit.
UK financial services exports, which had been growing rapidly, have been redirected through Dublin, Amsterdam, Paris, and Frankfurt. The distributional effects of Brexit are as important as the aggregate numbers. The regions that voted most heavily for Brexit, the post-industrial Midlands and North, coastal towns that felt left behind by globalization, have not benefited from the sovereignty they voted for, because sovereignty is not a substitute for investment, infrastructure, and economic opportunity. London, which voted heavily to remain, has absorbed much of the financial services relocation from the continent, but even London's financial dominance has been partially eroded as companies seeking EU market access chose Dublin or Amsterdam over a post-Brexit London. The political cost is harder to measure, but equally real. Brexit consumed the governing bandwidth of 3 prime ministers, Cameron, May, and Johnson, and produced a period of political instability culminating in 2022 when Britain had 3 prime ministers in 6 weeks. The Northern Ireland problem has not been resolved. It has been managed with a framework that both unionist and nationalist communities in Northern Ireland find unsatisfactory for different reasons. Scotland's independence movement, re-energized by Brexit, has made the United Kingdom's long-term territorial integrity a live question in a way it was not before 2016.
Chapter 8. Ireland's Vulnerability and Britain's Path Forward. Ireland's economic model has a vulnerability that its government has been managing carefully for several years. The OECD global minimum corporate tax of 15%, agreed in 2021 and being implemented by over 130 countries, directly targets the competitive advantage that Ireland built its model on. Ireland's 12.5% rate, the foundation of its multinational attraction strategy for 40 years, is now below the agreed global floor. Ireland raised its headline rate to 15% for large multinationals in 2024, but the practical impact depends on how the top-up tax rules are implemented across all jurisdictions. The question is whether the companies that chose Ireland for its tax rate will stay now that the rate advantage has narrowed. The Irish government's position is that the multinationals chose Ireland for more than just the tax rate. The English language, the common law legal system, the EU single market access, the educated workforce, and the established ecosystem of suppliers and talent that has built up around the tech and pharma clusters in Dublin and Cork are genuine competitive advantages that survive a tax rate increase. This is probably correct in the medium term, but it is not guaranteed in the long term. And Ireland is aware that its dependence on 10 companies for 85% of corporate tax revenue is a concentration risk that would be alarming in any other context. Britain's path forward is genuinely unclear. The 2024 election of a Labour government under Keir Starmer brought a new tone and a commitment to rebuilding relationships with the EU, but not a commitment to rejoining the single market or the customs union, which would be the economically significant steps. The reset with Europe that the Labour government pursued through 2025 produced improved diplomatic relations and some easing of non-tariff barriers, but the fundamental trade architecture of Brexit, outside the single market, outside the customs union, with a hard border between Great Britain and the EU, remained in place. Britain's options for closing the productivity gap with Ireland and with the rest of the G7 are limited as long as that architecture persists. Chapter 9. 2 countries, 2 models, 1 question. Ireland's model worked beyond any reasonable expectation. A country of 5.1 million people that left the United Kingdom broke and traumatized in 1922 has, through a combination of strategic EU membership, aggressive FDI attraction, and a corporate tax rate that made it the obvious European choice for American multinationals, built a per capita income that exceeds its former colonizers. The Celtic Tiger, the financial crisis, and the recovery together constitute one of the most instructive economic narratives of the 20th and 21st centuries. Small countries can punch far above their weight if they choose the right partners, the right institutions, and the right competitive position. The cost,
an economy dangerously concentrated in 10 companies, a housing crisis in Dublin that rivals London's, and a corporate tax model now under pressure from the global minimum tax agreement that Ireland helped negotiate, but whose full implementation will narrow the advantage Ireland spent 40 years building. Britain's model worked for most of the 20th century and then stopped working as clearly as it had. The post-war welfare state was a genuine achievement. The NHS is, by international standards, a highly efficient healthcare system that produces good outcomes at modest cost. But the industrial base that funded it was not replaced when it declined. The financial model that Thatcherism built was geographically and socially unequal in ways that accumulated into the political alienation that produced Brexit. And Brexit itself has imposed a measurable and ongoing economic cost on the country. Britain is still a large, wealthy, and influential economy. It has world-class universities, a globally significant financial sector, and cultural and soft power that Ireland cannot match at scale. But it is growing more slowly than almost any comparable economy, and the structural reasons for that slower growth are now embedded in its trade architecture in ways that are politically very difficult to reverse. The deepest irony in this story is this: the framework that Ireland used to escape its dependence on Britain, the European single market, is the same framework that Britain voted to leave. Ireland got rich by joining Europe. Britain got poorer by a measurable amount by leaving it. The 300 kilometers of border between them is the most consequential 300 kilometers in British and Irish economic history since 1922, and it is still not fully resolved. In 1922, Ireland left the United Kingdom as its poorest constituent part. A century later, the question of which country made the better choices in the intervening years has an answer. It is not the answer that most people in 1922 would have predicted. The colonized, now richer than the colonizer. The choices are still being made. This is Macro Atlas. Thank you for watching.